Well, good evening all. The title of my talk today which is focused on hops, is Small Hops and Giant Leaps, and a little bit of an introduction and a bit of expansion, I guess, on hops and what they do in brewing and where they come from. So I always like to know my audience. So firstly, how many beer drinkers do we have in the room? Hands up. That's bloody excellent. How many home brewers do we have? Ooh, good smattering of those as well. Out of those beer drinkers, how many hop heads do we have? Oh, that's pretty good too. And do we have any craft brewers in the room? No, they wouldn't all listen to me. Jade's here though, so we know we're all good. Okay, so I'm going to try to control this machine here. I will waffle on a bit during the presentation, I'm sure, but it's all comes to a fantastic end with a bit of beer tasting, so you'll be able to sort of lock into what's actually happening in terms of appreciating the beer against what I'm talking about this evening. So let's try this. Oh, fantastic, it worked. Okay, so what are hops? I think in Australia we don't really have a knowledge of that. Even people that are mainstream beer drinkers wouldn't know that. We can drive through the countryside in South Australia, we can drive up to the Clear Valley, we can drive through the Murray Lands, we can see barley in the fields, we can see wheat in the fields, and we kind of know what that is. And we know hops are used in brewing, but we never drive through South Australia or much of mainland Australia and see hops growing anywhere. So what the hell are these things? We've all heard about hops, but what are they? Well, the hop plant is Humulus lupulus, and it's a bloody tall plant. It grows up to 5 to 6 metres tall. It goes about 6 foot, its root system goes down about 6 foot into the soil. And it's a pretty big vine. It's a climbing vine. It's a member of the hemp family. It's closely related to both the nettle and to cannabis, marijuana. In fact, it's part of the Cannabinaceae family. And it has flowers that appear in summer, which are followed by the cones, and then they're harvested in early autumn. So if we think about Australia where hops are grown, it's we're talking about harvesting them, around April, and those are then need to be put away for brewing for the whole year. So it's not something that we're harvesting all the time and goes fresh and it goes to the produce straight away. So let's try the next slide and see where we go from here. Oh, no. Okay, so there's a very specific climb or latitude in which hops can grow. They're quite demanding, they need a lot of water, and they do need 13 hours of sunlight. So up in the northern hemisphere you can see between 35 and 55, and likewise down in the southern hemisphere. So Adelaide, you can grow hops in. In fact, in the early colony, we would have grown them in Loberfall, we grew them in the southeast. You can make hops grow. Many people have made them grow and got cones off them. Some of the home brewers would have done that at home. Any home brewers here that have grown their own hops? No, come on, branch out. Oh, there's a man up the back that's done it. Successfully? Yeah? Yeah? Good. Okay, so you can see there that bottom line goes in. Adelaide's within that band. What you've got to be very careful about is where you position your hops, because they do need those 13 hours of sunlight a day if they're going to flower and if they're going to grow the cones, and you're going to get some sort of reasonable yield out of them. So I've tried to grow them at semaphore. In my backyard it's very difficult to find a spot where they can actually get the sun for most of the day, so I struggle with that. You can see New Zealand's right in the middle of the band there too, so some really good hops coming through from New Zealand. So in Australia, predominantly we see them growing down in Tassie, and there's a couple of areas within Tassie where they're grown. Bushy Park's well known for it, sort of in the middle of Tassie. In southern Victoria, the Ovens Valley and Ross River is an area where they grow hops as well, and growing quite successfully. So if you think about those hops and you think about the fact they grow up like that, you wonder, well, why don't we grow them in other places? If we can grow them in the Adelaide Hills, why doesn't everybody grow them? Well, they're quite expensive to set up. You need to have big vines that are up really tall, 5 metres tall. So a little bit like growing grapes, there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to go in place before you set up to do it. And the price of hops in times gone by wasn't all that good, because in Australia in particular, what the world was after was bittering hops. So they were after the bitter compounds that go into beer that have the bitter flavour. They weren't looking for the aroma volatiles that we are these days. So there's been a bit of a revolution in the way we grow hops, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go forward and talk into other aspects of hops. Okay, so why do we use hops? What's their role in brewing? Primarily, they're there as a balance to the sweet residual flavour left after fermentation. So we're putting a lot of barley, malted barley or wheat, into the brew. This ferments out, but it doesn't ferment out completely, so it leaves some residual complex carbohydrates behind, and that generally has a sweet balance. So if you put no hops or anything into the brew, you'll have quite a sweet tasting brew. So to balance that sweetness, brewers are looking to put something else in, so we have a balanced flavour. So in days gone by, it would have been things like nettles, juniper. There were a whole lot of herbs and spices that were added to add some counterbalance to the sweetness that comes through from malt. So traditionally ales would not have had hops in it. So the traditional natural ales that were fermented by yeast that fell in out of the environment in Mesopotamia, going back many thousands of years ago before Christ, they would not have had hops in them. The hop plant was sort of recorded as being known and used around about 500 AD, but it really only became used in beer around about 1400s. So the early areas that we used were in the medieval times, the monasteries, the monks. They started to use hops, and they started to note that ales containing hops kept longer. So what the hops were actually doing, without them knowing it, was that the hops had a preservative action against a lot of sportage bacteria that would normally fall into beer and would make it go sour very quickly. So there was a benefit from that point of view, as well as the balancing of flavour. That secondary attribute was preserving the beer, making it last longer. And the third benefit from them is adding complexity to the flavour. So if you think about Australian lagers, they're developed here. They don't have a hell of a lot of hops in them. The hops that are in there are really about balancing that sweetness, bitterness. They're meant to be easy drinking with a warm climate. The aromas that come from those hops are quite subtle. So a normal Australian lager that we've drank for many years is a great refreshing beer for summer, but it doesn't have a lot of flavour complexity. So in these days where all of us as consumers are looking to know what we're putting in our mouths, to know more about it, to look for more of an experience where we're perhaps not just looking for refreshment, but we're looking to consume something that actually intrigues us with flavour, and we're looking for differentiation of flavour, then the fact of using hops to actually add this differentiation to beer is a really important one that's emerging. Okay, so the brewing process, a quick recap. So all those that do home brewing know about all this stuff already, but basically there's two sections to the brewing process. Brewing implies that there's some heat used in the operation. So unlike wine, a brewing operation involves getting the fermentable extract out of a grain. And unlike we're using a fruit base where the sugars are free and they're fermented, in a grain you've got complex starches. So you have to break them down in some way, and that's what the brewing process does. So you've got grains coming in, milling, going through into the mash tun, and then the mash tun is the process by which those complex carbohydrates break down to maltose. So in the case of barley malt, it's maltose that's produced. Maltose is a fermentable sugar. The yeast will turn that into alcohol. Then we've got to get the husk material out, so we go into the lauter tun, which is over here. And from the lauter tun, we then move into the kettle. And the kettle is where we sterilise the brew that we're making. So boiling the process of boiling for about an hour sterilises completely the wort. All of those natural microorganisms that were on the grain are dead, they're gone. So we're making a sterile environment so the fermenting yeast can then do its job, and that is to turn those carbohydrates into alcohol. So that's the first spot where we start to add hops. So hops, these nice little coney-like creatures there, into the kettle they go. In that boiling process, they convert into bittering substances. Quite efficient. But as you might expect, a boiling process, there's a lot of steam going off. So a lot of the volatiles that are in the hops, the flavour components that are in the hop, are disappearing up the funnel. So we're really aiming to get the bitter flavour that you would perceive on your tongue, on your taste buds, in this part of the process. Then we go to the next stage, which is the whirlpool. So the boiling process is over, but the wort, or the liquid sugar solution that we've produced for making beer, is now no longer boiling, but it's still at quite a high temperature. So we can add some hops in at this stage, and because it's not boiling and it's not vigorous and they're in that whirlpool for a relatively short period of time, we can capture some of those essential oils and volatile oils that are in the brew. And they will remain in the beer and go through. We still do lose some, and because of the high temperature, they also convert into other compounds, so you don't get as good a yield of some of those natural essential oils in the brew. Then we move on and we go through to fermentation. We cool that wort down and we ferment it. We add the yeast. Now, some of the volatiles that are in there are subject to the action of the yeast as well. So the yeast will take some of those things into it. It'll turn them into other compounds. Some of them will be retained there, but again, you're losing some of the volatile aromatic components that would add to the flavour of the beer. At the end of fermentation, we take the yeast off and we separate the beer and we take it through to what we call maturation. And in maturation, there is another opportunity, and this is what we call dry hopping. So the three stages of really adding hops are into the kettle during boiling, which is principally getting bitterness. Later on in the whirlpool, which we call a late addition of hops, and that captures some of the aroma, but loses some of it as well, so it's still not particularly efficient. And then that last stage, which we call dry hopping, which is added after the beer's essentially made. It's being fermented, it's got its finished alcohol content, you remove the yeast, and you're then putting it in contact with raw hops, and so you're absorbing all of those compounds again. And they will be carried, once you separate the hops off, they'll be carried through in the finished beer, right through the process, through filtration, into the bottle or the keg. So, they're the three ways that we add hops. Okay, now, I'm a chemist, so you're going to get some of these horrible chemical formula things that don't mean a lot to a lot of you, but it's interesting. So there are three things that are happening with hops during the brewing process. Hop bitter flavour. We've got acids in there which are primarily humulone, and in that boiling process we're getting what we call an isomerization. So what that really means is by the way of the reactions that are taking place during boiling, you're making compounds that are more water soluble. So they've got more bitterness. The bitterness in the flavour from the humulone is transferred into the water, so it's more soluble. If you didn't have that boiling process, then those bitter flavour compounds would really not get into solution, so you would lose most of them in the process. So that's really what we're doing there. So that's how we make Australian lagers, for example. We're all about trying to get that bitterness in there, and for many, many years, the Australian hop industry would have been concentrating on making the type of hops that give those bitter flavours, give the maximum of them. They weren't worried one iota about what the volatile content of those hops were, so they were pretty much concentrating on varieties of hops that deliver good bitterness. And that meant that one whole component that could go into beer that could add depth to the flavour wasn't really in the hops that were there, because they were all designed to go in the kettle and they would be lost in the end. Then the second part is that late addition that I was talking about in the whirlpool not being at a boiling temperature, and for example, little creatures, Sierra Nevada would be examples of breweries that use a hop vat. So what they do at the end of the whirlpool, they have another vessel where they run the hot wort liquid over the hops. and that enables it to be at a lower temperature, enables it to extract some of those essential oils, carry it through into the fermentation. So what you're getting there is you're getting a better return on those volatiles that are in there. So you're getting more flavour in there. Things like linalool, geraniol. Anybody know geraniol? That's sort of that rosy, rosewater type character. So those things won't necessarily be there in a beer sticking out like rosewater, but they'll be in their whole background. They'll be adding complexity to the flavours of it. And then the third area of where we add hops is by adding beer later in the process when it's finished fermentation. We're adding them into what we call the storage beer or the maturation beer, and it captures some of the raw hop components like myrcene. Now, they would have been in the hops right back at the start here, but via the boiling process, they would have converted into other compounds. So you're getting some of these really raw, grassy type characters, terpene type characters that are in there, and they're adding a real aroma component to the beer. So a good way, those three basic ways of adding hops to beer, and really it's probably these, we start to see these sort of things in lagers as late additions, adding low levels of hop volatiles into them, but it's really been through the craft beer scene and some of the new styles of beer like American Pale Ales, American IPAs, where we've really started to explore this hop volatiles. How can we get them in there? How can we get them in there at high levels? How can we retain them in the beer? What will that do by using different varieties? And that's led basically the hop growers and the hop breeders to try to look at new varieties and say, well, what sort of components can we get out of some of these varieties? Varieties that a number of years before they would have just thrown out because they always said, nah, it doesn't have enough bittering character on the scrap heap. We'll keep on crossing our varieties and we'll be looking for things that are going to deliver that. All of a sudden they're looking for things that are going to deliver volatiles. And that's led to a great change in the varieties of hops that are available and the type of flavours that they can introduce into beer. Okay, so dry hopping, what is it? That last stage where we add it later in the process. Why do they call it dry hopping? Well, it's not really dry because it's still wet in here. But what we're talking about is it's not in a boiling process. So it's an old technique, and it's a technique that was first probably used with hops back in the UK, and it came in around about the time that they were starting to export the pale ales from England across to the Indian colonies. So they had a lot of soldiers and a lot of public service in India. They wanted a good beer, hot climate, wanted to be able to drink our pale ales. And unfortunately, when they put them on the ships and they sent them over there, by the time they arrived in India, they'd all gone sour and they were horrible. So the brewers started to think in those days where science wasn't, really perfected, how the hell do we make these beers keep better? So they took their beer, which was quite often fermented in barrels and it had come to almost the end of the fermentation, but they hadn't taken the yeast off it. And they thought, well, there's only two things we can do. We know if we go higher in alcohol, that the preservative properties of the beer will be increased. It will take some of the microorganisms that spoil beer out. And we also know that, we're starting to know that hops actually preserve beer. So what if we, before we load on the ships, while it's still just, the yeast is still active, what if we put some more fresh wort in there so that the alcohol content goes up and it keeps on fermenting while it's actually on the ship? And what if we stuff some hops in there as well, so we lift the level of hops? So what they were doing there was the early example of dry hopping. They were doing it into the end of fermentation, almost at the end of fermentation. And what they discovered was when those beers arrived in the Indian colony, what do you know? They're actually a little bit different than they were back in England, but they're in good condition. So they were fit to be bottled, they were fit to be consumed. So success, great stuff. So dry hopping is typically defined as adding hops on the cold side at the end of fermentation, not adding them in the brew house, adding them in the cold side, either at the fermentation temperature towards the end of fermentation, which might be somewhere around about 18, 20 degrees or so, or even adding them cold later on when you've taken the beer back to cold temperatures. Of course, back in these days, they didn't have refrigeration, so as cold as it got was probably room temperature. So what does this do? It results in an increase in certain hop aroma components, and it basically captures a lot of the hop essential oils within the beer. So what that leads to is otherwise things which would have disappeared out of beer and not been present are so suddenly there and impacting on the flavour. So that's really the principal area that hops have really emerged over the last few years. So where do these things kind of impact on it? We've got a little flavour wheel there, which some people call the spider or the web diagram of where the flavours are in a beer. So it'll be really interesting when we do the tasting later on to see you guys do that. And some of those things are things that are detected on the palate, and some of them are things that are in the aroma. So when you taste a beer, which we generally, you wouldn't go into the front bar at the Cold Lake Hotel down at Port Adelaide, you wouldn't pick your Tui's or your West End draft up and sniff it beforehand and swirl it around, or you probably wouldn't get out of the bar in very good condition. But it's exactly the same as wine tasting. There are volatiles in a beer, and when you pick that glass up in the first instance, there are some aroma components coming through. So the way you perceive flavour is all about the mixture of the aroma and also the flavours, the basic flavours that you pick up on your palate, your taste buds. The taste buds aren't the premier ones because most of the flavouring, all of the things that we perceive, come from the aroma components. So within your nasal cavity at the back, there are a lot more sensors that are working on those aroma volatiles than the taste buds that are working on your tongue to detect bitter, sweet, sour, savoury, those sort of things. So within that curve, the sort of things, I'm not sure I'm on a good lead here, the sort of things we're looking for that would be in the aroma around the sort of citrus fruit, generally hoppy. And people say, what is hoppy? Well, hoppy can be resiny, it can be spicy sometimes to a certain extent. Floral components, which also go into the esters that are produced during fermentation. Spicy, which I mentioned, and herbal type characters. And then there are things like maltiness, which is more about the sweetness, the balance of it. Toffee, that's sort of a more caramel character. The general sweetness, the initial bitterness, whether the palate's dry or it seems full at the end. Linger of the bitter, and the alcohol. So what these sort of crazy things do when you pull them together is some sort of a demented bat or something like that. Most of them do look a little bit bird-like, I've got to say, but they're a good judge for how the overall flavour of the beer works out. And it's those things down the right-hand side that are principally in the aroma. But of course, once you get them into your mouth, you've had a sniff beforehand, that helps you pick out those characters. Once you get them into your mouth, of course what's happening is your mouth is acting like a little flash oven, and it's pushing those volatiles up into your nasal cavity, and there you're perceiving them as a total flavour, the mouthfeel, the flavour, the sweetness, the bitterness, and also those volatile components that are in the beer as well. So a lot of what we do today, and a lot of the many beers, many people would say, gee, I didn't realise there were so many different types of beers. The Wheatie here is a classic example within Adelaide of offering a broad range of beers, craft beers, not sticking to the standard styles that we maybe think. But many of us don't actually realise that there's over 180 different styles of beer, and we've probably only really tasted a few of them. But what we're seeing now is we're seeing the brewers experiment, and they're saying, well, okay, it's great that back in the 1400s there was an India Pale Ale, and it's great that we define it as being an English style that looks like this. But what if I added different hops to it? Couldn't I change that a bit? And that's what differentiates between those beer styles. And it's exactly the same as the differentiation that's taking place between wines by bringing new great varieties and trying different techniques to create it. These days we're all about information, we like to know more about it, we like to know what goes into making a product that we're consuming, we like to know where it comes from, and we like to know as much as we can about how that's produced, what the creator thought about it. So we're starting to see a lot more information on labels, we're starting to see a lot more information in the media in various places, on websites, Twitter, whatever. So we're going to do a little bit of a tasting in a moment, and one of the beers that's up for tasting when Jay gets to do it is a particularly hoppy variety. So when you get to that beer, we'll talk you through it a little bit, and we'll talk about how you translate those aromas before you even put it into your mouth, into some of the characters that are coming through from the hops. That's the real winner in this whole process. The winner is that the consumer is getting better beer. The consumer is getting more varied beer, and these hops, which are basically flavouring or seasoning that goes in the beer, are helping differentiate and provide us with a lot more choice for a lot different tastes amongst our consumers. And there's never ever a right beer for any one person. We can stand there and we can talk about, oh, I like that one, that's my favourite. It's not even that I don't like it, but it's a personal thing. It's what you like, it's the flavours that you like within a beer. And we're learning more about that and more about what contributes to it. So if you like a fruity, hoppy beer, you know some of the other brands that you might go towards to try that. And you can actually explore and broaden your outlook on what's available. How are we going beer-wise?
Yeah, it's on its way.
It's on its way. So, yeah. So that's the base.